class, in this video, we are going to look at physical and cognitive development in early childhood. Just a second to fix this here. All right, and so, where is it? And setting the stage, there it is. I think that's it. All right, and setting that context, what is early childhood? So we define early childhood as about age 3 through kindergarten. So it's about 3 to 5 years old. And then middle childhood is going to be about 6 to about, we'll probably go with about 10, because then about by the age 10, that is when we come into adolescence. Of course, as we already know, there's a little flexibility in that because of diversity. So, some children can reach adolescence 7, 8, others, they don't really hit puberty until 16, 18. So, there's always going to be some overlap, and there always is going to be some diversity in the way we develop. And so when it comes to humans, we have to remember that psychology is not just about looking at the human mind body connection, but we're also looking at animals too. So when it comes to human, we see a unique cognitive skill of ours is our ability to reflect on others' actions, and then at this stage, kind of our ability to read minds of others. So what we mean by that is, it's not so much intuition, it's not a psychic ability, it's just those body language. It's, being able to read body language and discern different emotional states, because we already know that early in development, babies are aware of emotions and they react to facial expressions. So, as we grow older and we develop more and we're seeing these environmental influences, then we do start developing kind of that intuitive ability to be able to read other people's body language and essentially kind of discern what they are thinking. And we'll also have that ability to where we can think about the consequences of our actions and how those affect others. We start to see that in early childhood, and a big part of that has to do with socialization. And the family environment is important to socialization, but getting out into the overall society and community, that's really where we start to learn to socialize, because that's really where we're going to encounter differences. And we're outside the family, so we start getting into things like mate selection and gender differences. Those become more aware. And so when it comes to early childhood, if we look at Erickson's stages of development, we know that this is the age of exploration. This is when we have initiation versus guilt. So it's during this time, as we'll find out in our emotional development, that we start to develop those secondary emotion, things like guilt, shame, embarrassment. And once again, it goes back to that social context, is because, we don't naturally have those emotions like we naturally have fear, anger, sad, disgust, because those are innate survival mechanisms. Those secondary emotions, things like guilt, those are more a social conditioning, and it's a way to, get us working within the group context, right? Because as human beings, we are social creatures. We do need each other to survive and to navigate through life. So we have to learn, these different behavioral traits and what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. We have to then look at what our own motivations and intentions are for behaving the way we do, and maybe initiating those secondary emotions in other people. And then at this time, as we're also learning to navigate that social emotional realm, we're in the cognitive physical development. So this is when we're really starting to get inundated with the more structural side of society, right? This is when we start, learning reading, writing, and arithmetics. And then as we start developing more into middle childhood, then we start to get that kind of industry versus inferiority. And so that's really about us learning how to work with the group and how we fit into the group. And then a lot of what is going on in childhood, early middle childhood, is that we are setting ourselves up for the adult world, which is where we spend the majority of our lives and working towards understanding things like motivation, understanding things like morality, to starting to learn that needs and wants are not the same thing. And a lot of that is going to come from family influences, and then a big chunk of that really does come from social influences, because we spend a great majority of this period of our lives in social institutions, right? Being school. We go to school and we're working with other kids from other families. And so, we're at this stage, we're in many ways creating that adult reality that we're learning to be a part of. But, we're also creating a new version of it because it's a new generation coming up, right? Makes sense. And we see that with each generation, things in society change just a little bit to suit the taste of that group. Things like music, things like fashion, things like even popular foods, right? And so when it comes to our physical development, we still see that cephalocaudal growth and that mass to specific growth. So remember, when we were looking at infant development, that cephalocaudal, it's just when our bodies grow, and this is the same pretty much for any animals. I have to think of my lab puppy. He had a really big head when he was super tiny, and then his body got big, but for those first few months we would laugh at how big his head was compared to his body. And now it's like he's 5 now, and so he's filled out. So that's what the cephalocaudal principle is that pretty much we grow head to bottom, so top down, and then mass to specific. So on babies, tend to have that larger head, and then as we start to grow more, our bodies then kind of start to expand out to match that. And then mass to specific, as our bodies are expanding out, the large parts, torso, head, torso, and then specifics of legs, fingers, eyes, ears, all of that then is growing. And then, for the most part, symmetrical and proportional to each other, right? And then this is, we'll talk about this a little more when we go into our brain development here in a few minutes. But this is where we also see our fine motor skills and our gross motor skills to start really developing. And this just has to do with the coordination. Those gross motor skills are coordination. It's being able to, work your arms and legs and do whole body movements, and this is it's using your larger muscles. And then with those fine motor skills, that's when we're using kind of smaller muscles. So a good one would be a good example of fine motor skills would be learning to write. And that is something that we're not born with naturally knowing how to do. So that's something that we have to be taught, and it's a specific part of our brain that relates to those skills that allow us to do that, right? And then, so what we see with our fine and our gross motor skills is, at age 2, this would be an example of kind of a fine motor skill when you could start, when babies can start picking things up with their own fingers to eat, and then they start using a spoon. And then gross motor skills there is when you start to walk, because then you're using your skeleton, you're using the legs. rolling a ball, trying to throw a ball. That's a little of fine and gross motor skills because they're really not independent of each other, right? We need those little movements that our bodies make along with those big movements working together in order for us to function, right? So just not to sit here and read every word in this chart to you, but basically what we see with this chart is kind of examples of how our fine and gross motor skills develop at this age. And so we see, once again, it's a process. It's just like learning to walk. We've got to learn to roll over, got to learn to sit up, got to learn to crawl, and then, eventually our bodies are then developed enough that they can, stand us up and keep us balanced so that we're able then to start developing more of our fine motor skills, and then of course those gross motor skills too. And then when it comes to development, physical development, I was going to say development at this age, that physical development, play, being outdoors, getting proper nutrition. These are all very important to healthy growth. And so, modern society has presented some challenges to that. A lot of that has to do with the invention of the internet, because, that many studies show that that is leading to things like obesity and children at younger ages. It's also leading to maybe just not, I don't want to say intelligence as in like a negative context, but it's just, not being outside, getting that vitamin D, staring at a computer screen all day when our brains are really susceptible and still really developing, that there might be some stunting in that area. And then, of course, when it comes to nutrition and not getting proper nutrition, we see stunting in the physical sense, as in, children just not fully developing correctly. So, it's going to stunt something there. So you're not, maybe like stunt your height or something on that lines. And then, of course, if your body's not getting proper nutrition, those fine and gross motor skills are going to be impaired. And then we also, because of that too, you're just going to be more tired, even at this young of age when we have a lot of energy. If you're not fueling your body properly to get the proper energy you need, then you're going to be a little more lethargic, and that does then affect your brain. If you're always sitting around and your body is lethargic and fatigued and you're not moving it, your brain's not getting exercise either. All right, so then that leads us to brain development. And this is when our brain really starts maturing in structure and function. So what we mean by that is it's actually taking on that brain shape that we all know, right? All the zombie movies show it. Everybody knows what a brain looks like. And so we know that the brain, the key part there, is the central nervous system that connects to the spine, and then those messengers that are carrying the information between the body and the brain, which is what really allows us to function and survive and be alive in this life. And those are our neurons, right? Those neural connections. And the neurons, they're made up of axons, dendrites, and then synapses. So you could think of it maybe as like a little train tracks, or maybe little power pole. I'm looking outside, like the electric and um, internet wires and the poles. It's kind of something similar. You can think of it that way, because it's these systems that run throughout our body, and each part plays a role in how that information gets passed on to the brain, and then how that brain then goes back and either tells your hand to write, or tells your heart to beat. And a lot of times that's going on in our unconscious minds, because think of that, it's a safety thing. Most of those fine and gross motor skill things that we do are in our unconscious part of our mind, right? We don't have to think about pick up the pen and write it out and hold your fingers this way. It's a natural thing that we do because we've been taught and we've been doing it a long time, right? Something like our heart's beating, that's think of how distracted we would be if all day long our brain was constantly telling us out loud to breathe and to walk and to do this and to do that. We'd be way more stressed out than we already are. So I think it's cool that our brain helps protect us in those ways. And of course, that's protection for the brain too, because it needs our bodies to function, and if it can't get its little vessel to work, and then it's going to die. And so we see that mind body connection is it's a balance type thing there. And so when it comes to looking at these neurons and creating these connected connections, synapses are important. Those are the little igniter between those two neurons that help light them up so it can send that message down down the line. Train track is what I was thinking there. And so synaptogenesis is just during this stage of development, we have a lot of that going on. So we have a lot of those connections being made. And guys, that's really something that continues throughout our life. It's not really until our early 30s that our brains are fully developed, which means that that synaptogenesis process is through. We've developed all the connections, and then at that point, it's kind of like we have other aspects of our brain and intelligence that we start using. And then, it's very easy. The older we get, we don't have proper nutrition, proper exercise, just proper environmental factors, and we start seeing that breakdown of those synapses and neuronal connections, and that leads to a brain degeneration, right? And then we also have this thing called synaptic pruning. So you've got to think of it as like a rose bush or a garden. If you don't go out and we'll go with the rose bush. So I'm looking at my little climbing roses right here in front of me. So if you don't prune your roses, you're going to end up with this. They're just going to grow out of control, right? And they're going to be all over the place, and you can't tell one side from another. And so and that's not really healthy for the plant, right? That's going to cause your roses to die quicker because there's too many of them in there fighting over the space and the nutrients. And also some of it is just some of it's not being used. Some parts of that plant isn't getting the nutrients to it because there's too much of it. Oh, I feel like this is stay with me, guys. I do have a point to make here. So we prune the roses to keep, not just to keep them pretty looking, but it's a way to keep them healthy. You got to think about it. It's cutting off those dead parts so that we can allow the parts that are alive to stay alive and regenerate. So that's a little bit of synaptic pruning is like that. As we're making these connections in our brain and we're being inundated with this information and we're learning how to do stuff, there is a part to where, some stuff you learn is not going to be valuable to you. So your brain's not going to keep that connection. It's going to snip that connection off and then, allow more energy to go to another part of your brain that you need. So it's just a way of maintaining your brain so that we get the most efficacy out of it. And, overproduction, reduction, pruning, this is all something that our brain does naturally, and it's a normal part of our brain development. I do think it makes more sense there when we think about bringing in information and things like memory. Like once you get to college, you start learning all these different ideas and theories. Some of them apply to your life and some of them don't apply to your life. So what do we do with the ones that don't apply to our life? We prune them. We snap that cord of what we have learned there, and then we continue on with our life. Or something here's a good example: prejudices, biases, stereotypes. If we don't want to be a person that is invested in thinking about those kind of things. We learn what they are. We say, yeah, don't really think I want to treat other people that way. And so our brain then kind of prunes that out, kind of snips that, you know. So it's just a way to help with adaptation and plasticity. So, like I said, so that our brains are most efficient. We'll talk about plasticity here in a minute. Myelination is basically when those axons, so the neurons are getting sheeted with these myelin, and so this myelin is this white fatty substance that wraps around the axons to help speed up transmission. So it's keeping those neurons firing properly. Think of that as like wires. All right. So like if you were to cut your TV cord and look at the wires, you have this one plastic wrapped cord, but when you open it, you've got all those little metal and copper wires in there, right? But it's being covered by that plastic to keep to keep from electrocuting us and to keep from that energy, electrical energy and charges from just that to being like just being wild and going all over the place. It's a way to contain them, to conduct them. So that plastic that covers the wires to keep everything safe, that's kind of what that myelin is. and and so, like I said, this is we need that fatty covering on our neurons, so we keep those neural connections strong. And so during early childhood, the connections from the cerebellum to the cerebral cortex, which help with balance and coordination, which is a big part of things that we're learning at this time. Think about those fine and gross motor skills, hand-eye coordination. That's a good fine motor skill we have to learn at this age. And then we also see that into early adulthood, kind of just what I was talking about how our brains don't totally mature until like our early 30s. We still have this myelination process going on. So, as we're making those connections, our brain is shaping and refining them so it's getting the optimal use out of it, because we have to remember these neural connections and the messages going on in our bodies, they're chemical and they're also electrical. So to keep our brains from over exhausting itself and from misfiring, we've got to have this process of synaptic pruning, and we have to have myelination. And then, as we see in our anatomy, we at this age we start to see changes in the gray matter, and that's kind of the working tissues of the cortex. And so, what we mean by that is that the gray matter is the parts of your brain that are, they're helping the other parts. It's giving it cushion, it's feeding the nutrients, and maybe in many ways it's helping direct those neural connections. But, it's definitely substances in our brain that the other parts need to work together. And so we see that at this part of development, as we're learning all these new skills, we're learning these refinement of skills, we see that gray matter changing. And even though the overall size of the brain doesn't change, we're going to see some changes to the parts inside it. And so what that means is we're going to see those areas of the brain that mature first are going to be the ones that directly relate to those fine and gross motor skills that we're learning. So, it's going to be that basic hand-eye learning to walk coordination, that those parts are going to mature first because, those are what we're using first. Then we start to learn about, think about Piaget and some of those, like the cliff experiments. We start to become visually aware of what's going on around us and being able to spot danger. And then language develops. And then, as we mature more, we get to more of the reasoning and executive functions. brain is also divided into hemisphere, and lateralization is what we call that. It means that there are two parts of our brain, and they control different sides of the body, but they're also involved in more specialized functions. And so we see during early childhood that the left hemisphere is more involved in language development, whereas the right hemisphere is more involved in spatial development. And handedness, do you write with your left hand, do you write with your right hand? We usually see that start to come out at age of 5, and that's part of lateralization. It does seem to see that hand and brain hemisphere are, depending on what hand you are, relates to what part of your brain hemisphere works more. However, there is no such thing as being singly right-handed or singularly left-handed, in the sense that we never just use one side. We're not, even though we say we're left brain and right brain, we are never totally one or the other. They always work together. It doesn't matter if one seems more prominent. It doesn't matter if that spatial right hemisphere seems more prominent in someone's personality. Their left brain is still being used too. You can't just switch off half of your brain and only use one part of it. So there's a little fallacy into that when we talk about left brain and right brain there. And then when it comes to what hand someone is going to use for writing, genetics and cultural influences play a role there. There was a point in American culture where being left-handed was seen as something weird, something different. It was something bad. And so if children would would start to learn to write and they would use their left hand, a lot of times it was kind of conditioned out of them. So they were made to instead of going with their natural inclination of wanting to use the left hand, they would be taught that they had to do it with their right hand. And then you have those and then we have those individuals that can use both hands pretty similarly, and that varies in degree too. There are people who can do a few things with their left hand, but maybe they're mostly right-handed. I'm the type of person, I write mostly with my right hand, but if I paint or something, I can do some stuff with my left hand. I always cut with my left hand. And so, once again, I just want to emphasize that it doesn't really matter what hand, what brain hemisphere or personality say is more dominant. We're still using both. It's still a dance between the brain. We can't have one without the other. We need both together. All right. And so because our brains are lateralized, we have the corpus callosum, which is this thin little tissue that connects those two brains together. And that's what allows them to communicate and coordinate. And so we see when there is incomplete development in the corpus callosum, there are things, retardation, and that's not the negative, un-PC way of calling somebody stupid when we talk about retardation. When we talk about that word in psychology, we're talking about something being stunted. That's really what retarded, the definition, means. It means something is stunted and not fully developed. And so, if you have a part of your brain that is not fully developed, and you're going to have some functioning issues, right? And then, of course, worst case scenarios, things like seizure or inability to control muscle movement, maybe with brain degeneration. So when our brains start to break down, Parkinson's disease, there's of course, corpus callosum plays a role in that, because Parkinson has to do with loss of muscle coordination. It has to do with loss of kind of like senses, as far as like physical body senses and stuff go, but it's mostly that body control and muscle movement there. And then at the stage of development, we have the frontal lobe developing the most because that is what we consider the executive part of our brain. So that's where all our problem solving, organizing, emotional regularization come in. And, those are really a key skills that we must develop in order to navigate life, in order to interact with others. And so these are things that we're starting to learn at this stage of development in early childhood. And then we have brain plasticity. And basically, what this means is that our brain can be shaped and altered by our experiences. And there's also a degree of like rebound. So think of it maybe as like silly putty, like slime or Play-Doh, one of those things that kind of has a what's it, viscosity, malleability, to where you can take silly putty and you can kind of mold it and shape it, you can stretch it out, and you can also put it back together, right? So if you have a ball of silly putty, you've got the ball, you can do all these other things to it, and then you can make it back into a ball. And so that's a little bit about what plasticity means. It's not plastic like hard, rigid plastic. It means that there's some play, there's some malleability to our brains. And so it's this cool thing that brains do. So if some damage to the brain can be fixed on its own because of plasticity. And then, our brains get shaped because of experience. So addiction is a good example that's coming up. So if you have an addiction, say you're addicted to whatever, it doesn't matter. And your brain is going to change because of whatever chemical, which is basically dopamine, is getting into is being produced by that addiction. So when you stop, or we'll use heroin, that makes a better sense. So you're getting all that heroin in your brain and in your system, and it is changing your brain. And so when you come off of that, your brain is it's all that heroin chemical is going to get out of your brain, and your brain is kind of going to go back to the way it was before. Does that make sense, guys? And of course, there is a point where plasticity doesn't work, right? There's a point where you pull that silly putty so much that you break it in half. And even though we have this psychogenesis, and when our brains get damaged, the neurons are in synapses, try to repair itself. Plasticity allows some repair. There is a point to where our brains can be so damaged that plasticity doesn't work anymore because it's beyond our brain's ability to repair itself. And during this early childhood time in life, our brain is really open to environmental experiences. So it's definitely being molded and shaped by what it, as in the brain and the child, is being molded and shaped by what they see around them and what they're putting into their bodies, and also what they're observing, how other people are behaving. All of that is affecting the brain and how it develops. And then we see that language development is an important task at this time period. And of course, our brain is most ripe for acquiring languages. They say if you ever want to learn a second language, it's definitely easiest to do it at this age because our brains are so open. They literally are sponges soaking up everything, and so it's definitely easier to learn something when a kid is small. But we also see that presents some cultural, social challenges because if we inundate our children with too many activities at one time in these early stages of development while their brains are still maturing, we're going to create overload, and that's going to have an effect on, not only the way the brain is developing, but also how the child is going to grow up and become a fully functioning adult. Can create burnout, it maybe create rebellion, addiction, and then at the same time, you also get geniuses too. So once again, we have to remember that when it comes to development, even though we have these age groups, we have stages, there's still fluctuation and diversity, because even though we're all human beings, we're all slightly different and develop in our own ways. You know, we look at these stages as guidelines because we want everybody to be happy and healthy. And what's most important in learning about these crucial developments at what stages is when we see, you know, lack of development, because we want to make sure we catch those things early enough so that the child that is experiencing that lack of development is still able to grow up and be a fully functioning adult that is, you know, working on their self actualization and, you know, striving for optimal happiness and well being, just like the rest of us. So, once again, and looking at motor development, just reiterating these gross motor skills and fine motor skills. And we also see that there are cultural difference in some of the fine motor skills, because it just depends on what's going on in that culture and how children are viewed. And so, you know, and we see, for example, just I'm not going to read this whole slide to you guys. I know we're all adults. Everybody can read and comprehend what's here. These are some kind of cool cultural examples. And so um, drawing is something that we see that emerges in most cultures. You know, that's an easy way to distract children in any culture. Hand them a piece of paper and a crayon and say, here, you know, let your imagination run wild. And then we see around age 3, regardless of the culture we're in, by this time children are aware enough of their environments that they start to try to draw things they recognize. And then we also see that some minor fine motor skills, like once again hand-eye coordination, are going to vary depending on culture, because in some cultures children, you know, do these tasks at earlier ages. So for example, in the Mayan communities, we see little children learning how to weave rugs at an early age, and you know, that is developing those fine motor skills. And a lot of it has to do with that idea of just getting things right. And a lot of which fine motor skill is, or not which, but about how we go about accomplishing and defining those fine motor skills is going to be dependent on the culture, because of what is going on in that culture, if that makes any sense. So, you know, in our Western culture, children are definitely, childhood is way more free. Children are more free to do things. I won't say that's necessarily a good thing, but in other cultures, you know, by at age 4 learning how to weave rugs, that's important for the Mayan community because of globalization, modernization. They don't teach the kids how to continue doing this cultural tradition, then you know they can very much, it can be a skill that gets swallowed up and lost as everybody becomes, you know, McDonald's wearing Old Navy, right? And so when it comes to cognitive development, we've already looked a little bit into Piaget and his stages of cognitive development. And so we know in early childhood, we are at the pre-operational stage of thinking. And basically, at this stage, children are a little egocentric. We're focused on us in the world. We only understand our perception of the world. We don't get that other people think differently. And so it's hard to conceptualize. And the more we engage with others, the more we learn how other people think and other people aren't like us. And then we start to get more of those concrete operational skills. And we also have to think too that, you know, why from 3 to 7 do children seem to be a little more egotistical, think the whole world revolves around them, everybody thinks about them? Is because we've just come out of that stage to where we are very dependent on our caregivers. So put that into the ego, as in the child's perspective, and what do you see? We see at that age, life is all about you as the 1 year old, as the 2 year old, because if you don't have those caregivers taking care of the baby's not going to grow up, right? So it's easy for us to stay stuck in a limited mode of thinking. And then, guys, our brains just aren't developed enough for us to start grasping those more abstract and concrete thinking. And then at the same time, there's a lot of abstract thinking that goes on at this age because of imagination, and because we don't have those concrete ideas of boy, girl, black, white, Muslim, Hindu. You know, you're not really a dog. People can't really turn into, werewolves, whatever. We have imagination, and it's very much the main mode of how children go about exploring the world. And it's a good thing, as we tend to grow up, we tend to say things like imagination, creativity, magic. Those things aren't real, they're childish, leave them in the past. But I would argue that our imaginations and creativity are really what set us apart and make us different from the other animals and species on this planet, because our imaginations are how we are able to create the world around. And think about it, that phone, that computer that you're using to watch this lecture, it was somebody's imagination first. Somebody imagined it, and then they created it. So it's very healthy for kids to have active imaginations at this time. We can get a little bit of parapsychology there, because this is when, kids start having like imaginary friends too. And so that gets into just our questioning of what really is reality, and things like consciousness, and what happens when you die. Is imaginary friend just a kid making something up in their head, or, are they really talking to dead people? Interesting stuff there. If you ever get a chance and want to look into not paranormal studies, look into actual parapsychology. And, it's most of the stuff you'll see on the History Channel, and the like ghost shows, but they of course take a little more psychological approach to it. And so when it comes to this age, there's this kind of like brain fart that everybody seems to have when it comes to conservations and substances, in that we don't really understand numbers and mass and volumes and liquid and matter. We don't understand irreversibility. And the reason is because once again, it goes back to that center. As a child at this stage of development, we're only coming from our own egocentric interpretation of 3 to 4 years of living on the earth. We don't know any better. We don't know anything else. And so we see that there's kind of this, like I said, this brain fart, to where we can't understand that if you have two cookies, or if you have one cookie and you break the cookie in half and you divvy out, two halves, or if you just have a cookie and you break it in half and give it to the kid, and give another kid a whole cookie, the kids don't understand that they still have the same, each still has one cookie. All they see is, I have one and you have two. My little sisters used to fight about this kind of stuff all the time. They would like to eat hot dogs, and if I did not cut their hot dogs up into a specific amount of slice, cut them up into 5 slices that were the same size, those girls would argue that I gave one of them more. And yeah, they do it with our parents and my older sisters too. So it's kind of funny, if you have small kids, you have more than one, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Everybody's got to get 10 little fishies. You just can't throw a handful down in front of the kid, because if one looks different, they've got more, they got less. And so we're not really sure why children don't understand that. And I would once again just go to argue. I kind of believe Piaget. It's just because we don't have that total world view. Nobody has ever taught us before this stage that breaking it in half is same. It's just something we have to put together. It's kind of like learning algebra. Nobody, you don't learn that a plus b squared equals 34 because it's like, well, how do you put numbers and letters and they equal numbers, right? You don't know how that works until you're taught. No difference here. We don't understand conservation until we're taught it. And so we just see, I think last week or maybe this week too, there should be some of the old video footages on Piaget in our materials. Those are actually kind of cool. They're cool just because I like them just to see everybody in their 70s outfits and hairstyles and clothing. But it's also cute some of the studies and the um, answers the kids give, like the one on perspective, and they're looking at the mountain with the little boy, and she's asking him what he sees on the little model, and then she's trying to ask him, well, what do I see over on this side? And he's pointing off everything he sees, thinking that's what she can see too. And I like it so much because it's got a little goat. Of course, you guys know I have goats, so I know the little boy's like, a little goat. You see the little goat? And so as I've been kind of critiquing Piaget, giving you some of those criticisms of his, as we've been going along here, it's just like I said, as kids, we just don't know as much. We're more focused on our egocentric interpretation of what's going around us. And then once again, we tend to think that that mind reading kind of, we're starting to develop to read body language and intuit emotions, and so that kind of inhibits our ability to differentiate in a way, because that's kind of what conservation is. It's learning discernment and differentiation. And I would argue that there are probably a lot of people well into middle and probably even late adulthood that haven't quite understand those things yet, right? And then when it comes to culture, we see that there's going to be differences in how conservation is learned, and that has to do with attention. That's kind of that example of the Mayans teaching the children at very young age how to weave rugs to develop those fine motor skills. What we pay attention to in our environments, what's important to those who are taking care of us, is going to affect our development. And so, because of some of these criticisms to Piaget, we then have Vygotsky come along and have his sociocultural theory of development. And so, because we don't exist in isolation, and because this is truly the time in life when we first start really getting exposed to social institutions, and we're learning how to work with others, and we're learning these new skills and ability. Learning is not just this egocentric task at this stage of development. Meaning, as it's not just something that's focused on the individual or even the individual environment. It's a whole, oh, I know, here's a good way to say it. It's the whole, it takes a village to raise a child mentality, is that, everything that's going on in that child's environment is going to have effect on their development. And so when it comes to learning, we have the zone of proximal development. And this is at that stage of learning when someone's teaching us and we need their help, versus when we actually start to be able to do that on our own, right? And so one of the main ways that we learn is through scaffolding. Now, in a construction context, scaffolding, before you can build a house, and put up the bones, which are, all the support beams that are going to hold your walls up, hold your roof up. You kind of have to make fake bones and fake walls that hold all that up. It's called scaffolding. And then off that scaffolding, you take part, as you build parts of the house, part of that scaffolding comes down. You move it to other areas. Sometimes that scaffolding will get incorporated into what you're building. It just kind of depends on how you're building your house. But your scaffolding, kind of think of it as it's like this pre-model. It's this thing, like I said, you can't build a house. You can't put a wall up without building some kind of support system that's going to keep you safe from that wall falling on you. You've got to kind of have this mock wall that you build, and these mock bones, or to put a roof on, you have to have like these mock beams to help you get the real roof up there. So when it comes to learning, scaffolding is the same way. That's think of when you're learning to read. A good scaffolding trick there is phonetics. We teach the sounds a, ah, bull, and so you help the child out by kind of giving him that, like, what's that word? Think about it. What's it sound like? Sound it out, and you'll help them sound it out. You give them those little hints and clues, and to help the child, start to piece it together in their mind what the skills are that they are needing to acquire. And so then as they learn that, that piece of scaffolding is going to come down, and then you're going to go put it up somewhere else. And so, asking questions, that's something as children, we say children ask too many questions, and then you get to be an adult and it's like, oh, we shouldn't question anything. Questioning is healthy, part of life, part of being alive, part of evolution, development, and surviving means that we have to question life. You can't ever take everything for face value, because then, the main thing there is it puts your survival in jeopardy. And so it's no different at this stage of development. Children ask a lot of questions, and it's important as the parents, as the caregivers, to enforce that by helping to enforce that in learning by asking the child a lot of questions. That's also creating good communication and pro-social skills. We'll talk about pro-social skills when we get to our other lecture on social emotional development. And then we get a guided participation. And this is just, once again, Rogoff is just expanding upon Vygotsky, because that is really with any theory in any field you're going to learn. It started with somebody, and then everybody else kind of expands on that, kind of like what we learned in week 1 when we kind of were introduced to some of these theories on development. And we see how, like, Erickson, developed his stages of development. Ooh, that's a lot of the T word there, isn't it? Sorry. He created his developmental stages based off of Freud, and most people kind of based it off of Freud, and then other theories, things like Darwinism played a role in it, evolution, and you guys get my point, is that it's a building process, much like our maturation and development is a building process, and the things that are going on in our environment affect it. And so that's just what Rogoff is. He just kind of came along and said, well, it's not just that immediate, there's not really a zone of proximal distance. Yes, that's the immediate influence in a child's area, but it goes beyond that, because there's this whole wild world out there, and the way children are going to participate is through a guide, somebody else showing and teaching them how to go out and behave in the different situation. And then of course, once again, that's going to vary depending upon culture and what those cultures have set up as their rules of engagement and behavior. And it doesn't matter what culture, excuse me, and no matter where you go universally, getting along with others in public, generally being nice to other people, and that really is a universal rule of thumb. I know the media doesn't always like to share those stories as much, and kind of make it seem like that if we look around, we don't get along with each other, but that's just not true. More people on I at least want to believe that that's not true, because if we're really not getting along, I think society might have already fallen by now. And so well, I think I just repeated the slide, didn't I? Yeah, I just put that. Sorry about that, guys. And so, and wrapping this up, how we process and remember information is crucial to development. And once again, it's going to vary cross culturally. However, the process, that finite process of how we remember and absorb information, it's universal. We're always going to have the encoding, the storage, and the retrieval process. Okay. And so when it comes to learning and developing and maturing, especially at this age, and once again, I'd argue that attention and memory are important um, skills to have at any age, especially as adults, because we tend to get in a lot of conflict with others because we're just not focusing on things the same way, and that can cause a lot of problems in many different relationships. So being attentive, listening to others, reading body language, you know, those are all important skills to making us human, and they're important to learn at this stage of development. And once again, a lot of that is just because we're starting to actually get into more of a social context and engaging with others, and some of it has to do with the social emotional development of beginning to learn to read other people's body language and being attuned to their emotional states, and kind of having more empathy. Our empathy starts to really get created. So intention and memory are important to our cognitive development, because we have to be able to focus on information, and we have to be able to remember what that information was in order to have that healthy development. And then, of course, once again, there are going to be development in our brains, things like, the better attention we have, we see that lead to maturation in the prefrontal cortex and basal ganglia. So basically, that's just a fancy way of saying is that those of us who are able to better focus means that those parts of our brain are probably just are more developed at this age, and we see maybe their accelerated development. And then, of course, once again, social and family environments are going to play a big role in what we choose and how we learn to focus our attention and memory. And then, of course, this is the age when we really start to have language development. So we have vocabulary. And in vocabulary, it's pretty fast. We got that telegraphic speech, which is, you read it would be like overregulation, lots of rules and regulations taught at this stage, right? You guys, once again, if you have kids, you know what I'm talking about. If you don't have kids, think back to when you learned how to read. We all learned to read, and that, because the telegram, I'm not sure, some of you younger kids may not know what this is. I sure hope you guys do. But a telegraph, it was that first they were just kind of pressing a button and had to press a button. So it was like beep, 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 kind of thing, like Morse code, where it's like where you have those succession of taps, and it spells out words. When telegraph, that first stage of communication, be able to transmit information across large differences, it was very much this kind of tapping thing too. So it was like each word came at its own pace, right? And when we first learn to read, we have that we tend to talk in that very kind of robotic, kind of slow, emphasizing focusing on every word we say, right? And then at this point, and then fast mapping. That fast mapping is kind of it's related to scaffolding and how we create models in our brains, and there's a lot of schema, like Piaget says. We have those models being formed, and so based on, we start like with identifying what a dog is, and so what a dog is: four paws, wet tongue, tail wagging tail, and then you see a cat, and you think, oh, dog, and then you have to be taught, no, that's cat, and then you see a horse and dog, and big dog, no, horse. So mapping, so your brain is setting up those models, and then it's mapping everything it sees in the world and putting these labels on it as a way of understanding it. And then at this stage we have a lot of over regularization, because this is when we were starting to learn vocabulary, language, somatics, and so there's a lot of rules and regulations at this stage. A lot of this has to go with memory and focus too, because we're also being disciplined and taught a lot of just social rules of engagement, right? And then we have somatics, and of course this is just what words mean, how we put them together to make sentences that form speech. And sometimes this is when we start to get that specialized knowledge. So once again, we have those schemas of dog, cat, horse, and so then you could start to get really specialized. And so well, that dog is a German Shepherd, and that dog's a Yorkie. It's like specializing. We start to specialize, and no, dogs can't be blue, they're these colors in real life. So think of specialization like that. And so because we have all this language and brain development going on at this stage, literacy is very important. We feel that teaching kids to read and write at young ages is important. Sadly, statistically in the United States, there's a huge number of the population that are indeed illiterate. So it's really important that we teach children to be able to read and write. That is definitely a crucial social survival skill that we need. And then it goes back to those ideas of imagination that I was talking, and creativity that I was talking about earlier, because the reading is a good thing. It's good for our brains because it helps us learn things that we may never got to get to experience. um, it helps us imagine ourselves in different ways, because we can put ourselves in the place of the characters. And overall, what this is doing is, it's helping us create those pro-social skills. It's helping us develop our emotions. It's helping us learn how to communicate with others. And then, and all of that, it's just good for our brains and our bodies. That might be it, guys. I'm stuck. Oh, yeah. Okay. So we're almost finished here, guys. So just real quickly, as our language skills are developing, this is then also when we start focusing on mathematical. Oh, let me get this to stop. We focus more on the mathematical. Sorry, guys. It's just being crazy. We start to focus on learning mathematical skills, so magnitude, numbers, counting, addition, and subtraction. So just basic math concept as at this age. And then, of course, when it comes to this stage of development, quality childcare is important. Generally by this stage of the infant, neophyte individual's development as a toddler, this is when you're really going to see, both parents are probably going to go back to working outside of the home. Because now the child is old enough to start, going and socializing in society and participating in those social institutions. So, childcare, early education are important things that, especially here in Western society, we focus on, not just our American Western society, but even just Western society like Europe in general. And then even actually I take that back, because in Eastern society, early education and childcare is very important. Think of like Japan and China, and yeah. And so the quality of the child care, once again, I can't stress it enough. We'll talk about it all throughout class, and at any stage of development, what is going on in our environments is going to directly relate to how we perceive situations and how we feel about situations. And so another way of saying that is that, our environments are definitely going to affect our cognitive and social development. And in these early childhood stages, structure and quality are very important. And so, that's big issues in the United States. We'll just focus on our culture here in the USA. Child education programs, there are disparities there based on socioeconomic levels, maybe even systematic racism has caused some disparities in childcare and educational programs. And just goes back to what I've kind of said all along. We don't exist in isolation. We're all here together. And being human does mean that we learn to work with each other. And I don't even think it's learning to work with each other. It's just naturally a part of who we are as human beings. We want to be around other people. We, even it's okay if you're kind of like me and maybe not a totally social person. I like my alone time too, right? That's okay, guys. That's part of being humans too. It takes all of us with all of our different skills and, working together to make life work. And if we want to ensure the success of our species, then it's important that we set those stages and environments and interactions. We set those up in the most positive, productive, and healthy ways that we can, so that, our children and get to live just as happy and healthy lives as we do. So that ends our lecture on cognitive and physical development. So thanks, guys. If you need anything, reach out to me.